These confused pictures show the British raiding the Sinn Féin office in an attempt to harass those setting up the alternative state. Before British repression, the Dáil and its bureaucracy went underground. But with coercion came a political initiative, the Government of Ireland Act. It was the old Home Rule idea. A parliament in Dublin with important powers reserved to Westminster, and to accommodate the North, another in Belfast. The government wanted a Belfast parliament for the 9 counties of Ulster, where there was the same number of Protestants, shown in orange, and Catholics, shown in green. The Unionists preferred a 6-county state, where Protestants would be the majority. The cabinet acquiesced. Despite the fact that Protestants would hold sway in the Belfast Parliament, many Unionists, seen here protesting outside the House of Commons, remained unhappy with the Home Rule idea.
They did not want Home Rule at any price. They wanted to remain forever a part of the United Kingdom, and they wanted, of course, the whole of Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. But since that was no longer possible, they had to accept the situation which Lloyd George now proposed to impose upon them. And Sir James Craig, in writing to Lloyd George, actually described it as the supreme sacrifice. He said, "We are prepared to make this supreme sacrifice in the interests of peace in Ireland."
The Government of Ireland Bill, so far as the Dáil was concerned, was to be ignored in its constitutional provisions. They believed that it would not operate, that it could be made effectively abortive. And they concentrated, first of all, in getting the elections going to renew the mandate for the Republic, to participate in the elections in order to renew the mandate for the Republic, and simultaneously to escalate the guerrilla campaign in order to show the British that they meant business and that this solution was not acceptable.
In the south, troops were a familiar sight, searches a daily occurrence. The Dáil would need an army to push Britain out of Ireland. As British soldiers policed the streets, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was being organised in secret. Its strategy was to render the country ungovernable by demoralising the army and the police and paralysing the civil administration. The only tactic against a professional army was guerrilla war.
We had an elected government and the British government of occupation had their army and their forces there, and we had to establish it, and lack of supplies and all that kind of thing. And the only way to do it was guerrilla warfare.
Practically an unarmed body of men fighting one of the biggest empires at that time in the world, armed to the teeth with tanks, guns, and God knows what. There was nothing left to us except guerrilla tactics.
It was quite easy for us to do it because the people were with us. We had no enemies, only the British forces.
During the early stages, like police barracks were attacked and they were evacuated, and at the corner they were evacuated, they were burned. And they had to pull back into more or less the stronger centres in the towns and places.
Attacks on the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, in the countryside had forced them back into the barracks in the towns. By mid-1920, 55 had been killed, and men were resigning mainly as a result of threats to their families at the rate of 200 a month. So the authorities were forced to recruit amongst ex-servicemen in England.
I came back from the war, the first war, and I thought that anything was better than standing in your queue. There were so many millions out of work.
I was deciding to join up the French Foreign Legion, and on inquiries I found out the pay was only 10 centimes a day.
And then I saw this advertisement in the paper about the Royal Irish Constabulary.
Recruits wanted for the RIC with good pay, danger money, prospects of promotion and a pension on the end. So I thought to myself, well, why should I risk my life and perhaps limbs for 10 centimes a day when I could join the RIC and get good money.
And then I had to go down to Chelsea to pass a test, which I did. And the next night I caught the train from Euston Station, and then I was in Avon Street, Dublin, in the morning.
By October 1920, more than 2,000 recruits had arrived to augment the Irish police. Although organised on military lines, they were nominally under police control. What the authorities never really clarified was whether they were to behave like soldiers or policemen. Their mixture of army and police uniforms symbolised their ambivalent role and gave them a nickname, the Black and Tans. As they patrolled the Irish countryside, their enemy was the IRA flying columns, groups of 20 men or so constantly on the move, attacking them and then melting into the countryside. A roadblock might be an ambush. Experience on the Western Front proved irrelevant when dealing with guerrillas, and the fight against an unseen enemy was both bewildering and frustrating.
In Ireland, you know, at that time there was the little low walls along the side of the roads, and if you saw one of those, you watched, because they'd be behind them, and if they dug a trench, you had to stop them. You were in action right away. And when we used to look up and we saw any pigeons or sparrows flying away from the roofs, we would dive into a doorway.
Sometimes you might get a car with not enough protection, you'd be able to lob a grenade in. And all you could do then was say, here, share that amongst you.
If we could catch them, we would kill them. They were on the, actually in the act of laying an ambush. It was a question of them or us. We were called by some journalists at the time the fleas, and we bit them and away and came back and bit them again.
We weren't scared at all. We didn't care about them as long as that we had a chance to fight back. And if you can fight back and shoot back, then you feel all right.
But it was difficult to shoot back. As killings and ambushes of the police and troops became commonplace, the Black and Tans began to take reprisals on those they suspected of harbouring the rebels. Creameries, so crucial to Ireland's dairy economy, were wrecked, like this one at Mallow. Houses were sacked and burnt. Suspects were shot. These reprisals convinced the Irish that Britain was unfit to administer Ireland and led them to support the IRA. The Black and Tans are remembered and hated to this day.
They just ran through every town and village, guns at the ready, firing indiscriminately at passers-by, and at night breaking into people's houses, taking all the males out and bringing them either to the jail or barracks, questioning them and searching them, and very often took people out and they didn't come back home again, they were killed.
They were a complete law to themselves. They were given a free hand to do what they liked, and they did what they liked. They shot, burned, murdered, beat up, did anything they liked, and they burned Balbriggan and many other Irish towns.
They were killed.
They were a complete law to themselves. They were given a free hand to do what they liked, and they did what they liked. They shot, burned, murdered, beat up, did anything they liked, and they burned Balbriggan and many other Irish towns.
The case of Balbriggan, a small seaside town near Dublin, was not untypical. On the 20th of September 1920, a senior policeman was killed. That night, policemen broke into, looted and burnt 4 pubs, 49 houses, and a hosiery factory. The morning saw families fleeing their homes. In England, public opinion grew restive. Concerned editorials appeared in the Times. The Sinn Féin strategy of making Ireland ungovernable by Britain was beginning to work. And there was another strategy being employed against the British, the hunger strike. London, 25th October 1920, Brixton Prison.
It was so long drawn out. People had no experience of long hunger strikes up to that date. When he passed 40 days, that there was no hope, we were expecting his death from day to day.
After 74 days, Terence MacSweeney died. He had been the Lord Mayor of Cork and the Commandant of the 1st IRA Cork Brigade. Before his death, he had written, "It is not those who can inflict the most, but those that can suffer the most who will conquer." His body was returned to Cork. Thousands attended his funeral.
We followed that man's agony until he died. And we weren't alone at that. The whole country were with Terence MacSweeney in Brixton Prison until he died.
After MacSweeney's death, the atmosphere in Ireland was electric. Here, British forces confront Dublin crowds. Meanwhile, British Secret Service officers had arrived in Dublin to break the IRA's network of informers in the British administration.
Word got out that what they call the Cairo gang had arrived here in Dublin. They were the cream of the British intelligence, and that they were living in civilian houses all over the city. And needless, I was a soldier, the men that was with me were soldiers. We never asked any questions. We got an order, we carried it out. Whether it was right or wrong, we carried out that order. We went up to the hall door, knocked at the door, and a maid opened the door, and I said, could I see Captain Bennett? Oh, she said, he's in bed. So he's very important, I must see him. We brought down Bennett down to Ames, and I said to them, you know you're British spies. You know the consequences if you're caught as a spy is death. I said, that's what's going to happen to you two men now. The Lord have mercy on your souls. So the two of them were shot.
Along with Bennett and Ames, the bodies of 10 other officers shot by the IRA were returned to England with full military honours. On the Sunday that had seen these shootings, Black and Tans had fired into a crowd at a Gaelic football match in Dublin. 12 people had died. It is remembered as Bloody Sunday. Ireland was at war. By late 1920, Ireland was fighting an effective guerrilla war. Around Cork, the IRA was particularly strong. In November, 16 members of the security forces were killed in an ambush. There was another a fortnight later. By late 1920, Ireland was fighting an effective guerrilla war. Around Cork, the IRA was particularly strong. In November, 16 members of the security forces were killed in an ambush. There was another a fortnight later.
As a small child in my nursery, I woke up to see the flames reflected through the north window on the wall, and I thought it was an aurora borealis, which we had seen the week before, and I called to my father. It was between, I suppose, 8 and 9 o'clock at night. And he said, no, he said, it's the damn British burning Cork.
I was a fireman in a fire brigade, and I received a call to proceed to Vigilance Cross. And on our way out, we saw the fire in the Grand Parade, part of Patrick Street burning, like, so we couldn't proceed any further.
They threw an incendiary into the City Hall as a last gasp, and that went up with a terrific crash. We saw that going up because that was lit by gas.
And when we turned on the water, all the horses were all stabbed with paints and rendered them all useless.
Black and Tans had gone into Cork, first looting and then burning down part of the city centre. They had prevented firemen from dealing with the blaze.
Well, the black smoke was coming up for nearly a week up the hill. And, we were nearly suffocated.
It was immense. It was as bad as anything I had seen in the Blitz in London.
There's hardly a building left.
British liberal opinion was outraged by these reprisals. Asquith reflected, "Things are being done in Ireland which would disgrace the blackest annals of the lowest despotisms in Europe."
They used to carry the holster on the thigh with a revolver, but hanging from the ring of the revolver, they had a half a burnt cork. And the attitude was that if you ambush us, now you know what's going to happen. Half of cork's been burnt, and be careful, we might burn your place down.
In December 1920, the government sanctioned official reprisals. Over the next few months, hundreds of homes of those suspected of being involved with the IRA were deliberately destroyed by Crown forces. But British government policy was ambivalent. Lloyd George, seen here with the Irish Secretary inspecting Black and Tans in London, was presiding over a cabinet wavering between a hard military line and a soft civil approach. As a result, there was no clear policy, no firm line on the reprisals. The army was furious over the indiscipline of these men, but could do nothing since they were under police control. Now, even a military victory would mean little.
The question that the soldiers themselves were asking then, and will always ask in these sort of circumstances, is then what? What next? What does this military success mean in political terms? It means nothing, because what you've done is to just introduce violence, oppression into the whole political system, and it's almost impossible to imagine that after this display of violence, the moderate majority will then turn around and say, well, now we're happy to cooperate with you in some form of amicable solution.
By April 1921, incidents involving the security forces and the IRA were running at about 60 a day. In May, they attacked the British local government office in Dublin. The army was now telling Lloyd George that a military victory could be achieved only by full martial law and the suspension of civil liberties. With the local government office burnt out and its records destroyed, Britain's already shaky control over the country was further weakened. Up north, the Unionists had accepted the provisions of the Government of Ireland Act, and in May went to the polls to elect their parliament.
Very rapidly, the feeling of not wanting the devolved parliament gave way to a sense of pride in the Belfast parliament, and a sense that with some good fortune it might be able to operate as a separate legislature under, of course, the overall supremacy of the Imperial Parliament at Westminster.
In late June, King George V, who had already an active interest in Irish affairs, opened the Belfast Parliament.
The visit itself, in a way, set a seal on the constitutional propriety of the setting up of Parliament. From the Unionist point of view, this was a very much needed boost to morale and made the best possible beginning for the new Parliament.
His speech was conciliatory and obviously directed towards the south.
I appeal to all Irishmen to stretch out the hand of forbearance, to forgive and forget, and to join in making for the land which they love a new era of peace.
It was time for a truce.
Political events were moving. There was an embryonic state or apparatus of state beginning in the north, and it was time to begin serious initiatives as well so that things would not get out of hand.
The IRA was showing clear signs of wear, and it's quite possible that had the British pressed on through the summer of 1921, they might have destroyed large parts of the IRA organisation. But this would have required a sort of effort which Lloyd George had by now decided was politically impossible.
The political climate did seem to be favourable. That is to say, public opinion, both in Britain and in America, seemed to be favourable towards the Irish claims in view of the stories of reprisals of the Black and Tans and of the conduct of the War of Independence. In propaganda terms, it was a favourable climate of opinion in which to begin negotiations.